Legacy Podcasts present Torq, a novel by Drago, performed for you by the author, and featuring music by Nicholas Allen Nelson. The Fourth Cog. "What are you staring at?" Lucy demanded. Rand's face reddened. He'd felt someone's gaze on him and had glanced toward the lift platform, where his eyes locked with those of an upper lass. Hers were green, not the brown common to the Lowerfolk. At first he guessed she was a maid, upperborn but still a servant, who'd come shopping in the middle market for her betters. But on second look, this was no maid. Her yellow hair was styled so intricately in an assortment of curls, locks, and braids that it barely seemed real. And her clothes were of tailored linen, not the plain woolen fabrics that servants in the uppers wore. No, she was nobody's maid, and not even an ordinary upper lass. This was an upper lady, so were her two friends. Rand expected to see the familiar expression of disdain that upperfolk typically wore when forced to look at a bowels rat. But it wasn't there. Instead, he read curiosity and maybe appraisal, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. Then Torq steam vaulted over the drop and landed right behind her. As one of her friends screamed and fainted, the upper lady turned to face the hero. Rand figured Torq would swipe her purse and vault again, raining the stolen coin over the Lowerfolk crowd before the keepers could stop him. A common occurrence. Instead, all he did was say something, kiss the lass's hands, and then run off, disappearing over the far side of the platform with the keepers on his heels. "Got an eye for upper lasses all of a sudden?" Lucy asked sourly. Rand replied, "No, it's just weird that Torq didn't..." Then came the shot. Rand whirled toward the sound, his heart in his throat. The sharp crack had come from the church quarter, toward where Torq had fled. A moment later, it was followed by a keeper's excited shout, "I hit him, boys! He's wounded! This way!" Torq was often shot at, but Rand had never heard of him actually being hit. If such a thing had happened, then the lowest champion needed help. The lifts in their adjacent platform occupied most of one whole edge of the market. Getting around them meant zigzagging through the rows of shops and cutting through a narrow tunnel that ran behind the lift mechanisms. Rand knew the route. It was too long. The quick path would take him over the platform itself, through the line of keepers guarding it, and then past the upperfolk they were guarding, none of whom would be happy to see him. But if Torq had, in fact, been shot... "Rand!" Lucy exclaimed. "Don't even think about it! You can't..." Rand took off running. As he bolted through the middle market, the nearby Lowerfolk buzzed about the show Torq had given them. Some were shrinking back from the sound of the gunshot, but others stayed put, probably thinking it was all more Torq-related fun. To some Lowerfolk, especially stainers and traders, Torq wasn't real exactly. He was entertainment, something to take their mind off their troubles. Interesting, but not important. Rand usually pitied them, but just now their apathy disgusted him. Ahead, he saw 4 of the lifts begin their ascent. The upperfolk on the platform, probably spooked by Torq's invasion, were heading home. Rand watched the cars rise ever higher, pulled by their taut chains, before disappearing into the drop, leaving behind the middle machine. The middle was basically just an enormous knot, far and away the largest. Geographically, it was separated into 3 sections: the middle market, the church quarter, and the enormous factory district, with its dozens of gigantic repurposed gearboxes, which occupied all of the space on the far side of the drop. It was there that Torq and the keepers had fought. Surrounding the middle on all sides were the outer walls of the machine, featureless and impenetrable. The machine had no windows, no doors, nothing at all to indicate what existed outside its borders, because nothing did. There was only the machine, alone in what everyone called the nowhere. The drop opened up in the center of the middle ceiling, and then opened again in its floor, with nothing in between but empty space, and, of course, the lifts. These were the only means of getting from the uppers to the middle and back again. No ladders, no stairs, not even pipes, just these gadgets. Each hugged a girder mounted into the rear of the lift platform, which extended vertically all the way up to the middle ceiling more than 100 feet overhead. Once there, they vanished into the upper drop. Where the lifts went after that was a mystery, at least to Rand. Such conveyances weren't for the likes of him. The platform itself was a wide raised dais overlooking the drop. Here the wealthy gathered and waited for keepers to escort them down into the market proper. The broad, ornate staircase which connected the platform to the maze of shops was guarded by a double brace of keepers, 4 stone-faced upperluds who doggedly maintained their post despite Torq's appearance. No way would they let Rand pass. "What are you going to do?" a small voice asked. Still running, Rand glanced back to see No Name following him, somehow keeping pace despite his much shorter legs. "Go back," Rand barked. No Name ignored him. The line of keepers was up ahead now, partially obscured by the Lowerfolk onlookers. They hadn't yet noticed Rand's approach, but they would. Lucy often told him he was too big to miss. "Just stay out of the way," he snapped at No Name. Then, as the last of the Lowerfolk leapt aside to let him pass, Rand came face to face with the keepers. All 4 upperluds reacted instantly, reaching for their pistols and swords. Rand charged them, intending to rush between the middle 2 and shove them into the other 2, hopefully knocking them all down. That would buy him time to reach the platform. Once there, Rand didn't think they'd risk shooting him in the back, not with the remaining upperfolk potentially in the line of fire. He hoped. But then No Name darted ahead of him, moving with shocking swiftness. The keepers, being focused on Rand, didn't seem to notice him. Wordlessly, No Name swung his satchel into the face of the first upperlud. Startled, the keepers staggered, drawing the others' attention. As they turned, the ludling slipped around behind them, moving like quicksilver, and swung his satchel again, this time hammering a second keeper's head hard enough to drop him to his knees. The last 2 drew their weapons and whirled around, towering over the little lud, which was when Rand arrived. He hit the 2 uninjured keepers first, elbowing one and boxing the ears of another. Both men went down. Next he grabbed another keeper, the one off balance from No Name's initial blow, and slammed him back down atop the keeper still on his knees. Their heads connected with a loud thunk, and they joined their colleagues on the floor of the knot. Around them the crowd scattered. It was never a good idea to be on hand when keepers were attacked. "Solid," Rand told No Name. "You too," the ludling replied. Together they rushed up the stairs. The only folk left on the platform were the upper lady and her 2 friends, one of whom was still sprawled unconscious on the floor. The moment they spotted No Name and Rand, the upper lady gasped. More, Rand thought, in surprise than alarm. Her companion, however, started screaming for the keepers. Ignoring them, Rand hurried to the far rail and looked out over the church quarter, with its converted gearboxes that served as temples to one or the other of the machine's 2 deities. Past them, around the drop and in the far distance, the huge factories loomed. These boxy metal structures dwarfed everything else in the knot, some of them reaching nearly to the middle's distant ceiling. Rand could see lines of Lowerfolk, thousands long, waiting outside each factory. These lines were there every hour of every day, manned by drudges who were hoping and praying to be allowed to work. Periodically the foreman, all upperfolk, came out and walked the line, as they called it, picking only the strongest for the day's labor. The rest went hungry. The sight always sickened Rand, but there was no sign of Torq. Then No Name pointed. Keepers, perhaps 20 of them, were converging in the shadow of one of the largest factories, a few dozen yards from the far side of the drop. Their quarry was a man in golden armor. "Go back to Lucy," Rand told No Name. "Who?" Rand suddenly realized that he hadn't, in the rush of activity, bothered with introductions. "Lucy Stamper, the redhead. She'll look after you. Go!" The ludling didn't move. "You don't want to be here when more keepers show up," Rand pressed. "Okay," No Name said. Satisfied, Rand vaulted over the railing, dropped to the floor, and sprinted after the mob of keepers. As he passed the churches, Rand noticed that the priests and matrons had emerged from their sanctified gearboxes to witness the commotion. Each wore either the ornate silver robes of Jaiism or the simple gray of root belief, and both spent their days catering to their respective flocks and defining the opposing deity as evil. The Lowerfolk worshipped Root. Lucy, who credited her healing powers to the Lower's god, attended weekly services. She always dragged the twins with her, but had given up trying to coax Rand, who wasn't much of a believer. Jai, on the other hand, belonged to the Upperfolk. Her gearbox down here in the middle was little more than a missionary chapel. The real Jaiist churches were in the uppers. Rand had heard rumors that they had one up there as big as any factory. A cathedral, they called it. Normally, Rand gave the churches little thought, but now, as he ran past them and their gawking clergy, he felt a fresh stab of anger. No Jaiist, of course, would lift a finger to help Torq, but Root's priests often gave sermons praising the hero's bravery. Even so, None would risk the keeper's wrath by actually helping him. Seconds later, Rand rounded another corner of the drop and crossed the unmarked border into the factory district. Here, nearly all commercial goods were manufactured, from clothing to food. Here was also where most Lowerfolk worked, those lucky enough to find employment at all. Owned exclusively by upperlords, the factories were manned by Lowerfolk who often worked for days, earning precious little coin. Though Rand had never been inside one, he'd heard about their brutal working conditions, the countless accidental deaths, and about the bodies that were unceremoniously dumped down the drop. After all, there was no shortage of replacements. Rand traced the outer wall of the nearest factory, an iron gearbox at least 60 feet tall and twice that wide. The eyes of countless Lowerfolk watched as he hurried past them, but not one offered to help, fearful of losing their place in the work line. Like the priests, they'd do nothing to help their champion. But this time Rand felt no anger. He knew the score. In the machine, you either worked or you starved, and for most, that meant the factories. Between this gearbox and the next, a broad open area reached all the way to the lip of the drop. There, finally, Rand spotted Torq. The hero, his hero, was clearly wounded. Torq's strength had gotten him this far, but now it was flagging. His bravado was gone, replaced by a stooped stagger that was carrying him closer to the drop. His gloved hands clutched at his side, his signature gilded length of pipe apparently lost, and his armor stained with blood. Keepers closed in, herding him toward the edge of the precipice. A few had drawn their pistols, but no more of them had fired. Apparently they wanted to take the lowest champion alive. Torq looked anxiously at them, his eyes bright with pain, and could that be fear? Rand spotted the pipe. It lay about 20 feet away, near the corner of the factory he'd just passed, overlooked by everyone. Desperately, Rand made for it, shoving Lowerfolk out of the way and snatching it off the floor. The pipe was about 18 inches long and made of gleaming gold, like all of Torq's famous armor. For a second he marveled. Torq's pipe! Experimentally, he hefted it. He'd never handled gold before, but he'd always heard it was heavy. Very heavy. Oddly, this wasn't. Nor was it smooth and featureless, as he'd always imagined. Instead, 3 controls were mounted into the pipe's surface, 2 buttons and a lever. The buttons had small black numbered counters beside them. One counter was currently set to 4, the other stood at 5, and below them a small thumb switch was flipped downward. No labels, but then Rand couldn't have read them anyway. The pipe seemed well balanced, and when Rand peered into one end, no light shone through. Not hollow. Torq's weapons were the blood of the machine, steam and grease. That was what the storytellers always said. In the tales they shared with Lings around cook fires of scavenged coal, Torq's abilities were drawn from the magic of the god Root. After all, he was the champion of the Lowerfolk, not the upperlords and their gadgets. That was why his chosen weapon was a length of ordinary pipe, imbued with miraculous power and turned to gold. Except this wasn't gold. Gold-plated, probably. But what really shocked Rand was the little thumb crank built into the lower side of the pipe. Designed to be inconspicuous, its purpose was nevertheless clear. Turning the crank charged an internal battery, which then powered the pipe. It was the way all electrical gadgets worked, though Rand had seen precious few of them in his life. This wasn't magic. This was mech. "What are you doing?" a voice called. Rand startled, thinking the words had been meant for him, but instead they'd been shouted at the line of keepers, who'd closed ranks around their long-sought quarry like hungry rats in the dark. And the speaker had been Torq. Except he didn't sound like Torq. No humor or mockery. This lud sounded terrified and in pain. "What did you do to me?" the champion wailed, retreating until the heels of his boots hung over the drop, the machine emptying behind him. Rand could read the trapped expression behind his mask. Pipe in hand, he charged to his hero's rescue. 2 keepers spotted him, saw the pipe, and raised their pistols. Almost without thinking, Rand pointed one end of the pipe at them, pressed the left-hand button, and hoped for the best. A jet of scalding vapor fired out from its business end, catching both men in the face and knocking them backward into their comrades. A half-dozen of them dropped together in a tangle of arms and legs, their pistols scattering. Another keeper lunged at him, but Rand swung the pipe, catching the lead across the temple. He went down, only to have 2 others take his place, sabers drawn. Rand fumbled for the pipe's other button and pressed it. As he'd hoped, a steam of black grease soaked the keeper's boots, Both men immediately slipped and fell, their heads clunking together loud enough to be heard. But there were more. Too many more. Torq gaped at Rand with desperate horror, swaying at the drop's edge. He said something, but given the cries of the surrounding keepers, Rand couldn't hear him. Then, as 4 more keepers rushed them, their pistols drawn, the lower's champion recoiled one last time. With a cry, his arms pinwheeling, he toppled backward. Rand instinctively reached out, managing to clamp one big hand around Torq's gilded wrist. Unfortunately, the hasty move had cost him his own balance. It only took him a half-second to realize his mistake, but that was a half-second too long. Rand felt Torq's weight tilt him over the edge. Son of a rat turd, he thought. An instant later, the two of them went tumbling into the inky blackness of the drop.